I want you to think about the best fantasy characters that you've ever read. What makes them so memorable, relatable, and interesting? It's not the magic they wield, it's not the worlds they explore, it's the process of struggle and change and transformation we see them go through over the course of a story. In other words, it is their character arc. Because without a compelling character arc, even the most fantastical worlds feel flat and boring. And that is because a well-written character arc is a metaphor for life and how you and I are also forced to evolve and change as we go through our own journeys and our own experiences. So when you can write a captivating character arc in your own fantasy novel, readers are going to have an insane amount of emotional investment in your story. They're going to be laughing alongside your characters. They're going to be crying alongside your characters. They're not going to be able to stop reading about their adventures. And when they are finally finished, they'll be recommending your book to all of their friends because for them, your characters no longer feel like characters. They feel like real, unique, three-dimensional people. Now, don't get me wrong, that is a hard goal to hit. I surveyed over 300 fantasy writers in preparation for this video, and a lot of you told me that you struggle to write character arcs that feel believable, show growth in a nuanced way, and integrate cohesively with your plot, theme, and other side characters. Now, I've built a lot of character arcs in my 4 published fantasy novels and in my video game as well, and I've personally helped 23 fantasy writers develop their character arcs either when I was editing their books as a client or when I was helping them outline their books in my fantasy outlining bootcamp. And that's not to mention the 130 plus story coaching calls I've done at this point to help writers further refine their novels. And from all this experience, I've built a system for writing character arcs, which I'm going to share with you in this video. So I really suggest that you take notes as we go through this because a lot of the things I'm sharing with you here are lessons and approaches that I've shared with clients who have paid me thousands of dollars to learn this stuff. This is not the only way to do it. It is just the way that I do it after 12 years of practice as a writer. And I've also seen it produce incredible results for my clients as well. So I think if you go through this whole video and take notes along the way, it will do the same for you as well. And the place we need to begin is actually by looking at the common character arc mistakes that new fantasy writers often make. I've identified 5 of these in particular, and the first one is just this lack of believability and realism. So this comes across when a character changes in a way that feels too rapid and too fast, or when the change doesn't feel realistic. Maybe you have someone who's sort of been a villain up until this point, and then the character says one line of dialogue to them, and they instantly flip around, and now they're the good guy. Of course, you can do that really well, but you've got to make sure it feels like it isn't just out of the blue. And then the other big thing that impacts the believability and realism of your character change is when it just feels like it was forced because the plot needed it, rather than feeling like an organic result of a character's motivations and life experiences up until that point. The second mistake is unsubtle demonstrations of change. So this usually comes across when you have characters saying very on-the-nose pieces of dialogue like, oh, I used to be a horrible person, but now I've realized that love and affection and kittens are the best thing ever. So you really want to avoid doing this. You want to be subtle and show characters changing, preferably through their actions and not just through these very on-the-nose pieces of dialogue. The third common character arc mistake is when you don't have any cohesion with your story's plot, theme, and other characters. There is this huge misconception in writing that I see all the time, which is that you either have a plot-driven story or you have a character-driven story. And I think that distinction is utterly foolish and it's going to be really hindering to you if you want to write a great fantasy novel. The reason for that is that plot is simply the actions that characters take in your novel. And the only way we understand characters is by the actions they take. I mean, if you just think about it, it's really hard to pick a fantasy character from a book. If you take any of the books on the bookshelf behind me here, it's really hard for me to just extract a character from that book and explain that character without also explaining all the events and the context that surrounds them. In other words, you have to basically explain what they do in the story and what their role is in the story in order to get that character's personality and traits across. And even if you aren't going to use the actual story itself to explain your character, you're probably just going to explain what they did before the story, their past, their upbringing, their childhood. In other words, their backstory, which is essentially the same as plot, but it's just plot that takes place before the pages of your novel. So ultimately, plot equals character and character equals plot. And as we go through this video, you're actually going to see this idea developed in much more detail. And if you're not convinced right now, I think by the end of the video, you may have changed your mind, because once you start to see the synthesis between these two things, it hugely elevates the quality of your character arcs in your story. The fourth common character arc mistake I see new writers making is making your characters too unlikable at the start. So this is a tricky one here because often character arcs are about seeing people progress from one way of being to another way. And if you're having a positive change arc where a character goes from being a bad person to a better person, you're probably going to show them in slightly unsympathetic ways at the beginning of your story. For example, maybe they're really selfish to begin, or they're a bit arrogant at the start. And over the course of the story, they become, more caring of others, or they become more humble. Now, it is important to have a big divergence between who the character is at the start of the story and at the end of the story if you are wanting to tell that kind of big transformation. But it is also important that you don't make the characters too off-putting at the beginning to the point where the reader actually just gives up on them and doesn't finish your story and doesn't see them evolving into becoming a better person. Now, don't worry though, because later in this video, I'm going to show you a very useful technique to avoid this mistake, even if you are writing a character that maybe has some undesirable traits or flaws at the beginning of your story. And then the final character arc mistake that new fantasy writers often make is no sense of uniqueness and surprise to your character's journey. In many cases, readers have a very good intuitive understanding of where your character is going in the pages of your fantasy story. They've read, dozens or hundreds of fantasy books. They've seen hundreds of movies at this point. Readers are very good at just picking up these patterns in all these stories and using that to predict where a character is going to end up. So when readers come into your story and they see a character who is a whiny farm boy who is thinking he'll never develop his magical abilities and he's complaining about the fact that the Empire has control over his nation, we intuitively know that this farm boy is probably going to master his magic, he's probably going to fight against the Empire, and he's probably going to win and bring freedom and peace to the galaxy. That is the kind of split-second, intuitive sense of what readers will have of that story just based on the patterns that they have seen before. And as a fantasy writer at the moment, you really have two choices in this scenario. So choice number one is that you subvert the reader's expectations. So maybe this farm boy actually gets killed halfway through the story and the Empire wins. So choice number two is you fulfill the promise that this setup has made to your reader, but you do it in a way that feels surprising yet inevitable. And I would argue that most popular, classic, great fantasy stories out there, they actually do the second option most of the time. That is, they fulfill the promise they made at the start, but they do it in a surprising yet inevitable way. We're not surprised when Harry Potter defeats Voldemort in the Harry Potter series. I think everyone knew at the start of the series that this was going to happen. However, the journey that Harry takes to get to this point, the sacrifices that are made along the way, the struggles he goes through, the change he experiences, and then of course the actual final way in which he resolves his last duel with Voldemort is done in a way that hopefully surprises us and delights us along the journey there. But again, that final duel makes total sense in hindsight once the rules of the world and the magic kind of click into place. Generally speaking, it's good to strike a balance between meeting the reader's expectations on a macro big picture level, yet surprising them with the little details along the journey to that point. Okay, so now that you see the kind of 5 common character arc mistakes that I often see new writers make whenever I'm editing a story or helping someone outline their book, let's move on to the 3 types of character arcs you can write, because there are a lot of ways that you can structure a character arc in your story, and it's important that you understand all 3 of these in depth so that you can pick the correct one for your characters and for your book. First of all, we have the positive change arc. So this one is pretty straightforward. The character becomes better over the course of the story. It's a journey from incompleteness and suffering to a sense of completeness and fulfillment and wholeness. For example, Bilbo Baggins in The Hobbit goes from being a sheltered homebody who's fearful of adventure to a free-spirited traveler who steals treasure from dragons and journeys all the way across Middle-earth. The next type of character arc is the negative arc. So this one shows a character's downfall or descent. And if you've read a tragedy, for example, or you've watched a tragic play, this is the arc that most tragic characters tend to follow. For example, in Best Served Cold by Joe Abercrombie, who I've actually had the pleasure of interviewing here on this YouTube channel, the character of Cole Shivers goes from being a optimistic, somewhat naive immigrant who's coming to this new land of Styria, looking for a fresh start, looking for fresh opportunity, and then he, over the course of the story, he kind of allows himself to slip back into his violent ways and allow the violence of his past to bleed into his present. And of course, other characters like Macbeth and Walter White are also great examples of a negative arc as well. And then lastly, we have the flat arc, which is something that can trip writers up sometimes because arc tends to imply change, but flat is sort of the antithesis of change. So a flat arc is just one where the character doesn't actually change that much over the course of the story. Rather, your focus is showing how they impact and change the world around them. So this is something that's often done in serialized stories, things like Sherlock Holmes, for example. Sherlock doesn't really change from story to story. We come to those stories because it's interesting to see the way in which he changes the world around him. And I would actually say Ned Stark in A Game of Thrones is a fantastic example of a flat arc and shows you that flat does not mean boring by any means. Ned is an honorable man in a dishonorable world, and when the immovable object of his honor encounters the unstoppable force of corruption in King's Landing, what will it mean for Westeros? So over the course of the rest of the video, I'm actually going to be going through in depth with Bilbo Baggins' arc, Cole Shiver's arc, and Ned Stark's arc. So there will be spoilers ahead for The Hobbit, Best Served Cold, and A Game of Thrones respectively, because I am going to be going into a lot of detail with all these different character arcs and showing you all the individual nuances of how they were constructed in such a brilliant and memorable manner. Okay, so there's 5 core building blocks that you will be using to develop your character arcs, whether you're writing a positive arc, a negative arc, or a flat arc. I'm going to go through them in brief detail, and then I'm going to unpack them with a little bit more depth. So the first component is the ghost. So the ghost is a sort of traumatic event which has shaped your character's worldview, made a major impact on their psyche, and is influencing the things they are pursuing in your story. As a result of this character's ghost, they have developed a lie. This is a warped, incorrect view of the world, which is hurting them, it is hurting the people around them as well, and it's going to lead to them pursuing their want. So this is an external thing that is outside of them that they believe will bring them happiness and completeness. But in reality, pursuing the want only strengthens the lie and gives more power to their ghost, which is haunting them. What they really need is to uncover their need, which is our fourth component here. The need is the thing that will actually make the character feel complete and happy and whole. And the only way that they can get to the need is by rejecting their lie and embracing the truth, which is a more accurate way of viewing the world and themselves and their role within it. So those are the 5 core arc components. Let's go through those in more detail with some examples and actually flesh out how you can develop these in your story. So first of all, looking at the ghost. So the ghost, like I said before, is usually a traumatic event that created the lie and the want within your character. It's typically something that either occurs before your story. So for example, maybe you're writing a fantasy book where your main character grew up in a war-torn nation, and this has left an indelible impact on her psyche. Your character's ghost might also occur at the start of the story. For example, maybe a parent is killed, or maybe a character is forced to move away to a boarding home that she doesn't want to go to. This could also be the foundation of your character's ghost. It is totally up to you if you want to reveal your character's ghost. You've really kind of got 3 options. You can blatantly put it out there on the page, you can maybe hint at it and leave it up to the reader's imagination as to the specifics of the ghost, or you can kind of keep it completely hidden and just have it as something that you know as the author, which strengthens your own psychological understanding of your characters, but you don't necessarily need to express it to your reader. And it's also worthwhile noting that in a series, as you go through, and we are going to be talking about structuring your character arcs over the course of a series later in this video, but in a series, the ghost might actually subtly change for each book. So in book 1, your character might struggle with the ghost for most of the story and then resolve their relationship with this thing, but the events of that book might lead to a new ghost being created in the next story. So for example, maybe in your first book, your character kind of falls in love with someone else, but then at the end of this book, they break up or this other person dies, and as a result of that, there is a new ghost that is now being formed for them to struggle with in book 2. And it also is worthwhile noting that your ghost doesn't necessarily have to be a negative event. I recently released a course titled 5 Days to Better Fantasy Characters. It's a totally free email course. I think we've had over 800 writers go through it so far, which is awesome. And I actually had a very interesting response from a writer called Joey who went through the course a few days ago. She emailed me asking, I was wondering whether it has to be a negative event at all. Can it be a positive event as well? I'm working on a book about a young bard who romanticizes heroes and, against the explicit wishes of his parents, sets out into the world to find and sing about current day heroes, only to figure out slowly over time the world isn't as pretty as he believes. And the heroes he romanticizes are basically frauds. His ghost, if I can call it that, isn't a negative experience, but rather him just absolutely falling in love with heroic music and poetry at a young age when he experiences a live performance from one of the best poets in the world. Would this qualify as a proper ghost, or will I have to introduce a negative event to give it more power? Joey has had a really fantastic interpretation of the ghost here, and I'm actually going to be updating the course as a result of Joey's fantastic email. So thank you, Joey, for sending in this question and for giving me permission to share it here, because she is totally right. You know, your ghost doesn't necessarily have to be this big negative, traumatic thing. I think that it just has to be something that has a big impact and it has this lingering presence in the back of your character's mind that really influences how they're moving through the world. To give you some inspiration for your character's ghost, here are 10 archetypes that your ghost might decide to follow. The first one is the loss of a protector, like a parent, a guardian, a friend, a sense of survivor's guilt, experience of being betrayed by an ally, by someone who was close to a character but wasn't in reality, a past failure that they're still struggling to move on from, a dark secret that's sort of haunting them inside, the experience of being exiled from a community, whether that's, a kind of family group, a friend group, or a professional group. Maybe they were a veteran of a great struggle like a war or even some political issue in the past. Maybe they grew up as an orphan, which, we see quite often in fantasy stories, but you can still absolutely do this in a good way. Maybe they witnessed something really traumatic that kind of left a bit of a scar on their mind. Or perhaps they're living under some kind of curse. Okay, so once you've got your character's ghost developed, then it's time to look at the lie. So the lie is our second out of the 5 core components of a character arc, and it is essentially a misconception a character has formed about themselves or the world as a result of their ghost. The lie is hurting your character even if they don't know it, and usually at the start of your fantasy book, your character is ignorant of the lie. In fact, they might even think the lie is a source of strength, but in reality it is something that's hurting them and the people around them as well. The lie is the main reason for your character's flaws. So it's making them incomplete, and you can find it by kind of looking at these different symptoms of how lies tend to manifest, which is the things characters are afraid of, or extreme hurt, inability to forgive other people, guilt, dark secrets, shame. All of these different things are typically manifestations of your character's lie. So if you're not entirely certain what your character's lie is right now, just look at these different things here and then trace back the reason for why the character is behaving in that way. It usually comes back to having a misconception about the world, which again goes back to their ghost. It's also really useful, particularly when you're writing a fantasy novel, to be asking yourself, how does my world building affect and potentially reinforce my character's lie? And you'll see with all 3 character examples I'm going through later in this video, with Bilbo Baggins, with Cole Shivers, and with Ned Stark, how the world building is used in a masterful way to actually develop and explore the lie in the characters' lives. So here are 10 lie archetypes that might give you some more inspiration as well. The character might believe that they are inherently unworthy, or that to trust other people is a form of weakness. Maybe that power is the only way to get safety, that happiness is something they will never be able to accomplish, that they have to do things alone in their life, that change of any type is dangerous, that emotions are a weakness that they should avoid at all costs, that self-sacrifice is noble and they should kind of, keep giving themselves up for other people, that they must uphold a particular tradition, or that love is a trap and a dangerous thing they should steer away from. So once you've got your character's lie, this is then going to inform their want. So the want is what your character thinks will make them happy or complete. It's usually something that is external and physical and kind of outside of the main character. They think that by grabbing this thing that's outside of them, it will solve whatever problem is actually up here in their head. And it is, again, an attempt to solve their incompleteness. They think they're going to be happy when they get it. And they will typically, in most stories, most positive arc stories, be spending most of the time on the page trying to accomplish this thing. The problem is that the more they pursue the want, it strengthens their lie. And when it comes to actually developing out the want, I like to use this tool I constructed called the axis of desire. So you can basically see here across the top of the axis, across the sort of vertical axis here, we've got all these different emotional things that a character could experience, whether they're revenge, power, love, knowledge, freedom, redemption, survival, justice, adventure, etc. And then across the top of the axis, we have the different external ways in which the character could potentially accomplish this thing. So they could get revenge against a person. They could get revenge by developing a particular status or role in a society. They could get love by finding a place, for example, or they could get love by, getting to a status or role that symbolizes love, or maybe allows them to get love from a lot of other people out there. And when you're using the axis of desire, which is something that I take my students through in my fantasy outlining bootcamp in quite some depth as well, you basically want to be sort of locating the main thing your character is going for. So in this example here, let's say my character is trying to accomplish survival, and the way that they're going to be doing that is by trying to find a place. So in other words, they're striving to reach or stay in a kind of safe haven or sanctuary. This is the plot of my fantasy novel, Across the Broken Stars. My main character, Leon, is helping a fugitive try to reach this place that is sort of mythical, that may or may not exist, in order to give them safety against the Inquisition that is pursuing them. And once you have located your sort of main want on this axis of desire, you can then actually spread out horizontally from that to find potential subplot ideas. So my character in Across the Broken Stars, he's trying to reach or stay in a safe haven or sanctuary, and there's a lot of different like subplots you could weave into that. So maybe to accomplish this goal, we then come across to the person column, and they have to now rely on a person for survival in a tough circumstance, or they have to find someone for information that's then going to lead to this safe haven or sanctuary. Maybe if you come across to the thing column, they actually have to seek an item that gives them a clue to get to this location. You get the idea. It's a way that you can kind of figure out the core want of your character and then kind of spread out with these different subplot ideas from here. So now that you have those three first components of your character arc, those are all the things that are sort of setting flaws and setting things for your character to overcome. Now we're going to start talking about the sort of more positive side of your character arc. So first of all, this begins with the need. So the need is what the character actually requires to be complete. Your character has the want, which they think will make them complete, and then it has the need, which will actually make them complete. So you can think about the need as something that provides a personalized antidote to your character's lie. And usually, unlike the want, which is typically external, it's outside of the character, the need is usually a key realization, a key internal epiphany that a character experiences. It's something that will typically challenge the status quo of the world around them, and maybe the people and the society around them as well. And to think about some different ways you can sort of structure your needs here are sort of 10 need archetypes I find useful. First of all is a character accepts themselves. Maybe they learn to have trust in others. Maybe they recognize that vulnerability can actually be a form of strength. Maybe they learn how to embrace change. They develop emotional honesty. They find personal happiness. They learn how to balance between themselves and others. They challenge tradition that has kind of oppressed them up until this point. Maybe they develop a newfound openness to love. Or maybe they learn how to kind of achieve self-validation without relying on other people around them. You can see, looking at these need archetypes, how they really contrast quite a bit to the lie archetypes that I explained earlier in this video. Because again, the need is something that is providing an antidote or a response to a character's lie. This brings us to the last part of a character arc in terms of the 5 core arc questions. So this is the character's truth. Again, this is something that's providing an antidote to the lie. The character is going to be struggling to accept this over the most of the story, and it's usually, in a positive arc type of story, only something your character will wrap their heads around towards the very end of the narrative. In fact, as I've sort of noted here, typically the climax occurs when your character accepts their truth and is able to vanquish the lie for good as a result. The truth is something that makes your character feel more complete. It's typically something that will relate to a core contradiction within a character as well. So maybe they've been struggling the whole story to sort of balance their duty to their family with their own desires and their own interests that they are pursuing. And the truth is something that's actually going to allow them to potentially resolve and collapse that core contradiction with a new understanding that allows it to stop being a source of suffering within their life. Having said that, the truth is not always an easy answer. Usually it's something that is quite hard won over the course of your narrative, and it might even open up more difficult questions for your character to face in the next book in your series. To give you some inspiration for potential character truths, it might be this belief that worthiness is something they intrinsically have, that trust in others is actually a sign of strength, that power doesn't guarantee safety, that happiness is within reach for them, that strength can be found in community and not just being a lone wolf, that change is a form of growth, that emotions are totally human and fine to experience, that self-care is necessary, that tradition can evolve and can change, and that love is strength. And of course, this is just a small sample of potential truths that your character could experience. As with all of these sort of archetypical examples I've given so far, there's really infinite possibility here. So don't stress if the one you're writing doesn't fit into the list of 10 I'm giving here. I also want to give credit to K.M. Weiland for a fantastic book titled Creating Character Arcs. This is where I actually found these sort of 5 core arc components, and I've since sort of developed that and refined that through my own writing. So it's a very good book and it's well worthwhile reading. So now that we have these 5 core arc components, here's how you use them to structure a positive arc in your fantasy novel. At the beginning, in a positive arc, your character is going to fully believe the lie as a result of the ghost. They're ignorant of the truth at this stage in the story, and so as a result, they're pursuing their want. However, as they go through this pursuit of the want, they realize the lie is hurting them, and it's perhaps hurting the people around them as well. So they begin to flirt with the truth. They test it out a little bit, they experiment using it, but the truth is challenged. It's not so easy to change their behavior in this way. So they're very tempted at this point to return to the lie, and at the climax, they are forced to have this really difficult decision. Will they pick the new truth and allow their old self to die, or will they allow their new self to die and will they revert back to believing the lie? And because it is a positive arc, the character is going to be picking the truth, they're going to be rejecting and vanquishing the lie, and they're going to be moving up in a state of completeness and development. And potentially, again, if you're writing a series, then this may sort of reset and it may change in the second book. But I will again explain that a bit later in this video. A great example of a positive character arc is Bilbo Baggins from The Hobbit. He goes through this experience of going from a place of comfort to slowly developing courage and eventually becoming a hero over the course of the story. His ghost is the fear of the unknown world that lies beyond his comfortable little life in the Shire. And the lie that he tells himself as a result of this ghost is that adventures are unnecessary and dangerous, and I am meant to live a quiet little hobbit life without danger or disturbance. And his want is simply, I just want to maintain my peaceful, uneventful life here in the Shire. I don't want to travel. However, the need he actually has is to embrace this inner craving for adventure that his subconscious has, to step out of his comfort zone and find the courage to grow and become a hero and actually become someone who goes off on these bold and daring quests. So the truth he eventually learns throughout the course of The Hobbit is that courage and a sense of adventure are these qualities that actually does lie within him and that he can accomplish great deeds. Now let's look at structuring a negative character arc. So in a negative character arc, you alter things a little bit here. At the beginning, your character actually fully believes the truth. They start by believing the truth. Notice this is the opposite to a positive character arc. The character also has their need met at the beginning of the story. So they know the truth and they are living with the need. You would think that they feel complete at this point, and usually they do. However, then the lie comes along, and the lie is a bit of a temptation for them. You know, it's something that maybe leads to them chasing their want and neglecting their need a little bit. As a result, the lie begins to overtake the truth. And the climax of a negative arc story typically presents the character with the last chance to step back from the abyss, to step back from the brink, and to return to the truth. However, they can't do it. The want is too tempting. They fully embrace the lie and they reject their truth. And again, this is a typical arc that most tragedies tend to follow. So let's look at an example of a fantastic negative character arc, which is Cold Shivers from Best Served Cold by Joe Abercrombie. Again, there's going to be spoilers ahead. For context on Best Served Cold, this is essentially Kill Bill set in a fantasy world. I absolutely love this story. And it is about this mercenary called Monza Mikado who tries to get revenge on the people who attempted to kill her. Shivers is, I would say, the second main character in this story. He has almost as much point of view chapters as Mikado. And he basically is this Northman who comes to the land of Styria, looking to put his violent past behind him, looking to have a new and peaceful and happy life. But he eventually kind of falls in with Mikado and begins to help her on her quest for revenge, which leads to him, sort of reverting to his old violent ways. So his arc is one of going from naivete to courage to love to despair, and then lastly to anger. And I didn't put it on here, but you could maybe argue then he kind of goes back to acceptance after anger here as well. So there's quite a few steps in his arc. It's a little bit longer than Bilbo's here. His ghost is his violent past as a warrior in the north. His truth, and you notice here that because this is a negative arc, I'm actually structuring things a little bit differently here. So the truth that Shivers has is that I can build this new peaceful life if I just stop using violence to find purpose and I allow myself to just kind of be an ordinary person and I'm not, going into my baser, more savage or angry ways. His need is to let go of his anger and his ego and move on from his violent past. And at the start of the story, he displays both the truth and the need. However, as he goes through his experience in Styria and he realizes it's not the paradise he was promised, he starts to kind of begrudge the fact that people treat him with disrespect and they're rude towards him. And so his want that he begins to develop is that I really want to regain respect, power, and affection from the people around me. which leads to his lie. And I've actually expressed his lie here in a direct quotation from a scene in the final pages of Best Served Cold, where Shiva says, "Reckon I've learned just to stick at the place I'm at, just to be the man I am." Mikado asks him, "What's that?" And he says, "A killer." So usually when you're studying stories, you can actually usually find direct quotes to support these 5 core components of a character's arc. Lastly, let's look at structuring a flat arc. So at the beginning of a flat arc, your character is going to fully believe the truth, and they likely already are living with their need. Remember, with a flat arc, the character themselves is not really the focus of change. Instead, you're looking more at how they impact the world around them. So this is the thing. While the character fully believes the truth and has the need, the world around them or other characters around them believes the lie. As a result, this leads to conflict. The world attempts to reinforce the lie, the character's truth is challenged, but the character, of course, remains steadfast because it is a flat arc, which doesn't mean that you can't necessarily have moments of doubt and uncertainty within them. It just means that within a flat arc, typically the character's sort of moral code and moral compass remains, relatively true north the whole time. This leads to 2 options for your climax. In the first option, your character's truth triumphs. They are able to bring the truth to the world, and the world kind of conforms to your character's view of things. With the second option, the lie is too strong. It vanquishes the truth and the character is defeated. This might be like a literal defeat where a character dies, or it may be more of a kind of moral or psychological or philosophical defeat. It's also worthwhile here that I'm talking about the notion of truth and lie, and that maybe makes you think that the character is having to persuade people to change their minds. That could be the avenue you take, but usually the truth and the lie is expressed in a more metaphorical sense of things. So if we take the example of Indiana Jones in Raiders of the Lost Ark, which is absolutely one of my favorite films, I love that movie so much, I've probably seen it like 20 times. Indiana goes through a flat arc. At the beginning of the story, he believes that these ancient artifacts belong in a museum. And at the end of the story, he believes that these ancient artifacts belong in a museum. However, the Nazis that he's fighting against, they don't believe this. They believe the lie that these ancient artifacts should be used to create their own power and to help with further their own evil goals. And so there's no point in which Indiana Jones convinces the Nazis to accept his truth. It's simply a case of his truth and the Nazis' lie kind of butting heads against each other in the physical realm until eventually Indiana Jones manages to outlast and outwit them long enough to get the Ark of the Covenant back into a museum, or at least that's what he thinks, ends up going into a government warehouse instead. So, technically he doesn't really win either. But the other form that your flat arc could go through is actually your main character being in more of a mentor role and using their truth to help a different character learn to accept that truth for themselves. So the character is the mentor in this case, and they are allowing another character to go through a positive change arc. That's one way you could also structure this. And a great example of a flat arc that certainly doesn't feel as boring as the name flat tends to convey is Ned Stark from A Game of Thrones. So he experiences a flat arc through this. His arc could be described as honor, conviction, and death as the final stage here. Again, the going to be spoilers for all of these, but I kind of assume that Ned Stark dies in Game of Thrones here. So Ned's ghost is kind of his loyalty to King Robert Baratheon, and his truth is that we must do what is right no matter the cost. He's a man of honor, he's a man of oaths. So his need that he has at the beginning of Game of Thrones is he has to remain true to his oaths. His lie, or the lie that the world presents at him rather, is that sometimes our oaths should bend for the greater good. And the want that is going to tempt Ned but never be something that he actually falls into, which is kind of ironic, is to stop Westeros from falling back into war. So you can see here how the truth and the need are paired. We must do what is right no matter the cost, and the need is to remain true to his oaths. And the lie and the want are also paired as well. In order to stop Westeros from falling back into war, maybe sometimes we should allow our oaths to bend. That lie and want combination is going to tempt Ned throughout the course of the story, but as we kind of see over the duration of the narrative, his truth and need win out. He goes through this flat journey, and as a result, he is later punished. So we are going to discuss the nuances of that a bit later and in more detail later in this video. Now, before we move on to discussing how theme fits into this whole picture of character arcs, I want to share a quick bonus tip at this point. No matter what type of character arc you're writing in your fantasy novel, I personally find it much easier when I outline my character arcs ahead of time to then write great character arcs in my first draft. When I started out as a writer when I was 14 years old and working on my first book, The Aeon Academy, I did not do this. I just started writing it by the seat of my pants, and as a result, the arcs in that story, if you even want to call them arcs, were just so messy and disjointed, and they made all of those mistakes I mentioned earlier in the video. Realistically, there probably wasn't even that much meaningful character change in that story. And as a result, it was never good enough that I felt even confident about trying to approach publication with that thing. But then when I came around to writing my second fantasy novel, Across the Broken Stars, which, spoilers, was eventually later published, I did actually approach that with an outline. And as a result of having that outline, it just made it so much easier for me to get my character arcs right before I even began writing that first draft. What's great about outlining for your character arcs is that you can work backwards from the end state or the end transformation that you're trying to get your character to create. So if you know you want them to get to a point of being selfless and brave, then you can work backwards and you can make them as selfish and cowardly as you possibly can at the start of your story, which is, kind of what Across the Broken Stars is all about. And right now you might be thinking, okay, Jed, I can see the benefits of that, but I'm worried about spoiling the joy of discovery. And I worry that if I outline my character arcs, it will rob a lot of my excitement as I go through the writing process. I certainly had that worry as well. I have not found that to be the case at all. Even with something like Kingdom of Dragons, my most recent fantasy novel, I wrote like a 30-page outline for this thing, yet there was still so much room for my characters to surprise and delight me with these little moments, and sometimes these quite big moments, as I was going through the process of writing the first draft. Outlining is simply just something that makes sure you have the structural scaffold there so that your story is working on this big picture level, and then it actually gives you more creative freedom to kind of paint in between those big picture structural moments that you have. Now, if you're wanting to write a really good fantasy character arc, it's critical to understand how theme integrates into your character's transformation. So first of all, I define theme as a moral argument that is explored in different ways through your story. It's not about, preaching or trying to ram a particular political message down the throat of your reader. It's simply about presenting a complex question about how best to live, and then having characters and your world and events in your plot explore that question and come up with different answers from all these different possible angles throughout your story. So for example, in The Hobbit, I would say the theme of that story is that true happiness comes from embracing adventure and stepping outside your comfort zone. And as we go through the character arcs later on, you're going to see how this is made manifest. In Best Served Cold by Joe Abercrombie, I would say that the theme is the pursuit of vengeance is a corruptive force that takes you further away from peace and leaves only destruction in its wake. So again, theme is an argument, and an argument means that you can kind of come at it from whatever angle you want. So there are some characters who kind of their arc demonstrates this theme. It demonstrates that vengeance is a corruptive force. But then there's also some characters where you kind of see vengeance genuinely bringing them maybe some semblance of peace or purpose or a bit of happiness at least. And so this is why the story feels morally complex and interesting to read. And then lastly, in A Game of Thrones, I would say the theme is honor is a hindrance if you wish to have power. Again, you will have characters come at this from lots of different angles. Now, what you're probably noticing with these different themes here is that they align pretty closely with our characters' truths. And generally speaking, when you have synthesis between your story's theme and the truth of a character's arc, that is how you tie your character arc to your theme in a way that creates a really resonant and emotionally and morally rich and interesting story to tell. Let's unpack the theme of A Game of Thrones in a little bit more detail. So we have some different quotes from various characters here. We have Littlefinger saying, "You wear your honor like a suit of armor, Stark. You think it keeps you safe, but all it does is weigh you down." So Littlefinger is kind of demonstrating the theme that honor is a hindrance when it comes to searching for power. We have Cersei say, "A true man does what he will, not what he must." So again, she's sort of taking a different interpretation and a different angle on this theme revolving around these ideas of honor. We have Lord Varys saying, "You're an honest and honorable man," Lord added. "Oftentimes I forget that. I have met so few of them in my life." He glanced around the cell. "When I see what honesty and honor have won you, I understand why." So again, all these different people with various perspectives on what honor is and what role it kind of has in this world. And then lastly from Jaime Lannister, "Give me honorable enemies rather than ambitious ones, and I'll sleep more easily by night." So earlier I promised to talk a little bit more about how you can structure character arcs in a series. And broadly speaking, there's a couple of different ways you can go about this. You might have your character go through a flat arc in the first book, and then they also go in a flat arc in the second book and all future books on after this. Again, stories where they're quite serialized in nature, where you're trying to write something where a reader could come into book 3, or they could come into book 5, or they could come into book 1, and they're still going to have a good experience, tend to use this kind of format. Another format you can use is you have a positive arc for your main character in the first book, And then from that point on, they sort of have flat arcs in the future books. So they learn important lessons in the first book, and then in future books, it's them kind of just using the truth they have learned from that first book, and with the need they have from that first book as well, using that to just sort of structure their arcs for the rest of the series. Now again, just because this says flat arc here doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be a boring second book. Quite often, the positive arc your character is going through in the first book here will create new challenges for them to solve in the second book. For example, if you look at a story like The Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson, in the first book, Kaladin goes from being this sort of hapless, depressed slave to eventually becoming the leader of this sort of crew of soldiers. And so he goes through a positive arc in the first book, but it doesn't mean that his transformation stops there, or his challenges stop there rather, because now he has added responsibilities that have come from the transformation and change he went through in the first book. Another arc you can do, which is a little bit more difficult but can be really interesting when it's pulled off well, is you have a positive arc for your character in the first book and then a negative arc in the second one. This is tricky because you want to avoid the feeling that progress has been undone, and you don't want to feel like the character has just reverted or reversed all of the growth that we spent so much time watching them go through. Having said that, there are stories that do this really, really well. I would say the first two Dune books in particular do this amazingly well. The first book is about Paul Atreides becoming the Messiah, becoming the emperor of this universe. But then in the second book, we kind of see the terrible ways in which that is destroying his life and destroying the lives of the people around him. And the ending of Dune Messiah, the second book in the series, just had me emotionally floored because of this descent that we see Paul go through in that story. And then another arc shape you can do here is you have a positive arc in the first book, and that leads to a different type of positive arc in the second one. You do need to pay attention to make sure that they don't feel too repetitive. You want to make sure that the type of challenge the main character is facing has evolved, or it's leveled up, or it's more difficult now, or there's more at stake, or there's just a different angle of conflict that's going to attack your character. You may also have your character go through a negative arc in the first book, only to redeem themselves with a bit more of a positive arc in the second. And of course, there's lots of other ways that you can play around with this as well. Okay, so those are the big picture principles behind your character arcs. But at this point, you're probably wondering, how do I actually integrate my character arcs cohesively with my plot? And to do this, we need to look at story structure. There are a ton of different ways you can structure your story. Right now, after 12 years of writing and having published 4 books at this point and done a bunch of other projects, the approach that I like to use personally and that works for me the best is what I call 9-point story structure. This is a slight modification on Dan Wells' 7-point plot structure, although I have made a few little tweaks along the way to kind of customize this more to my own preferences. And if you want me to personally help you outline the character arcs and the plot structure in your own fantasy novel, then you should apply for my Fantasy Outlining Bootcamp. This is a 7-week group program where you'll work alongside me and a small group of other writers to refine your character arcs, your plot, your world building, and all the other important aspects that go into writing a fantastic fantasy novel. If you think that this video has gone in depth on character arcs, just wait, the bootcamp is on a whole nother level. This is like a fraction of the stuff that we go through in that program, which is why it's so much fun to run. Plus, you'll also be joining this great community of dedicated and committed fantasy writers to be getting support and feedback and accountability as you go through your writing process. Here's what one of my students said about the program.
I cannot recommend it enough. It has been immensely helpful in ways that I couldn't have even imagined. Not only did I learn how to outline, I learned how to outline for myself with different tools that I can mix and match. So immensely helpful to have like-minded people to work with and bounce ideas off with, and sending in our stuff every week to meet the assignments and getting feedback from everybody. Thank you so much, Jed. It was an absolute blast.
The next cohort of this Fantasy Outlining Bootcamp is closing up pretty soon, and spots are very limited. I keep the cohort sizes small so that you get lots of personal feedback and attention from me. So you can apply using the link in the description down below, or by scanning this QR code up here. And if you are watching this video in the future and the current cohort that I'm talking about here has already closed, then you can always apply for the waitlist to potentially join future cohorts down the line. Okay, so let's go through 9-point story structure in some more detail here. And as we go through this, I'm going to be showing you the character arcs for Bilbo Baggins, Cole Shivers, and Ned Stark, and how they intersect with each of these 9 points in this particular way of structuring your story. So first of all, we have the hook, which is where you introduce your protagonist and especially his flaws and desires in a compelling way. The most important thing to get across in your hook is to show the characteristic moment. So this is basically the moment where readers understand what makes your character tick, where you get to see their flaws, you get to see their unique ways of approaching the world. An approach I always like to use, and I've recommended this to a lot of my clients and I've seen them take on the advice with great results here, is that somewhere in the opening 10 to 20 pages of your story, ideally, you want your main character to make a decision that 95% of other characters wouldn't be making in that situation. When you can do this effectively, it makes readers sit up and pay attention because hopefully you're giving them, through that unique decision, a character they haven't necessarily seen before. And so you're promising to them that they're going to get a new and interesting and novel experience as they go through your book. With your hook, you're also going to be showing your character living the lie. So at this point, if you're writing a positive arc, they're probably not too aware of the lie or its corrosive impacts on their existence. If, on the other hand, you're writing a negative arc, you might be showing them living the truth at this point here because the lie hasn't come along to tempt them yet. You might also be hinting at the ghost, that is the sort of main event which is lingering in the character's mind and influencing the way they are behaving. And in this part of the story, your character is typically aware of their want and they might be making some moves towards chasing that want. It's also critical, it's so critical here, I cannot emphasize this next point enough, that you establish rooting interest. So what do I mean by rooting interest? Well, rooting interest is simply just your way to answer the reader's question, which is always in the back of their mind when they are starting to read a new story. And that question is, why should I care? Why should I give a damn about these characters that I've just met? And broadly speaking, I've found that there's 5 main ways that you can establish rooting interest to pass the why should I care test for readers. The first one is to show sympathy. So demonstrate that your character has been unjustly punished by the world. As a result, we feel like they're a massive underdog, and so we begin to root for them to get out of this negative situation. A classic example here is Harry Potter. Harry starts the story as this unloved orphan who's living with an abusive aunt and uncle and cousin, and so we feel a great degree of sympathy towards him. And so that hook gives us a reason to care about Harry. And so then when he starts to experience all these amazing things later in the story, we celebrate that so much more because of where he started from. The next character hook you can use is skill. So perhaps you show a character who happens to be the master of their craft. Maybe they're an expert assassin, or they're a really strong magician, or there's something else that they're really good at. We find it so vicariously exciting to watch them excel in their field. A great example of skill as a hook for a character here is Gavin Guile in The Black Prism by Brent Weeks. So Gavin is the most powerful magician in the lands of this fantasy world, and he can basically craft solid structures from light. Because he's so powerful and so skilled at his craft, he does things that no one else can even attempt or even fathom. There's a great scene early on in the book where he builds this kind of skimmer device that goes across a sea, and when it builds up enough speed, it can sort of fly over this ocean. And it's this incredibly inventive feat, and it's just one of the many things he actually does throughout that book, which demonstrates his sort of unique capabilities around the magic here. The third hook you could use is a personality hook. So maybe your character has a unique voice, a cutting sense of wit, or some special way of seeing or perceiving or just moving through the world in general. A great example of this is Locke Lamora in The Lies of Locke Lamora by Scott Lynch. He's this very devious and charming and witty and sneaky thief. And the story really enhances this with this sort of swashbuckling sense of whimsy in its tone and world building. Let me read you a description from the prologue here that kind of perfectly expresses this. I've got kids that enjoy stealing. I've got kids that don't think about stealing one way or another. And I've got kids that just tolerate stealing because they know they've got nothing else to do. But nobody, and I mean nobody, has ever been hungry for it like this boy. If he had a bloody gash across his throat and a physician was trying to sew it up, Lamora would steal the needle and the thread and die laughing. He steals too much. Doesn't that just make you want to read on about this guy who is crazy even by the standards of thieves and conmen? The next character hook is progression, the promise that this character is going to improve. Generally, this takes one of 2 forms. Form number 1 is skill progression. So we see the character not being particularly talented with their magic or something else, and we get the promise that they are going to improve and get better at this craft over the course of the story. The second type of progression is a moral progression. We see the character behaving in a flawed or sort of incomplete way, and we get the promise that they're going to become a better person over the course of the narrative. Or vice versa. They're going to go down into some kind of tragic descent into madness instead. And of course, you can combine both of those here. A great example here is Po from Kung Fu Panda. He begins the story as this very chubby, unfit, out of shape person who doesn't really know anything about Kung Fu. And when he is thrust into the role of being the dragon warrior, he will have to learn to overcome these limitations and to become a truly great martial artist. And then the last main character hook you can use here is a worthy cause. So you have your character striving for a hard to reach ideal, particularly in a society where that ideal is maybe difficult to achieve and against pressure and conflict and resentment from maybe family, friends, loved ones, and other influences around them. Usually, the more opposition your character faces to achieve this worthy cause, the more compelling your character will feel. A great example here is Viv, the orc main character from Legends and Lattes by Travis Baldry, who I've actually interviewed on this channel as well. So Viv is an orc who kind of retires from a life as a barbarian adventurer to try to set up a coffee shop in this sort of fantasy city that has never heard of coffee before, and so the townspeople there have immense skepticism towards her. But this quest that she has, this worthy cause she has to bring this coffee to this people and to create this new sort of community spirit in this town, is something that creates a tremendous amount of sympathy for her. And of course, you can mix and match as many of these hooks as you like. For example, with Locke Lamora, he has a terrible upbringing as an orphan, so that's hook number 1, sympathy, which led to him becoming a skilled thief, that's hook number 2, skill, with a cheeky, witty, yet charming sense of humor, so that's hook number 3, who becomes an apprentice to an older, wiser thief and con man who teaches him the way of the con, which is hook number 4, progression. And then he has to use these skills to get revenge against an even worse criminal after a job gone wrong, which is hook number 5. So you can see here that Scott Lynch has basically used all 5 of these hooks here to make Locke Lamora a really compelling character. So let's see how the hook is manifested for Bilbo Baggins' arc in The Hobbit. So we begin with Bilbo living a very comfortable life in his cozy Hobbit hall, and we have this quote here from the story that demonstrates this well. The Baggins never had any adventures or did anything unexpected. You could tell what a Baggins would say on any question without the bother of asking him. However, this is a story of how a Baggins had an adventure and found himself doing and saying things altogether unexpected. How's that for a hook? So we're seeing here hook number 4, progression. Right now the character is comfortable, he's this homebody, he doesn't want to adventure, but we're going to see him go off on quite the adventure indeed. If we look at Best Served Cold and Call Shivers here, we have Call Shivers arriving in Styria, hoping to start a new life in this country that he was promised would be kind of a bit of a paradise compared to the cold and bitter north where he grew up. But it's not quite what he hoped for. Here's a quote from the book. First thing Shivers noticed as the boat wallowed in towards the wharfs, it was nothing like as warm as he'd been expecting. There's a spelling error I've said there. Life should be lives. It was nothing like as warm as he'd been expecting. He'd heard the sun always shone in Styria. He was done with war, done with leading men to death. He was set on being a better man. I should mention both those quotes don't necessarily happen right after each other, but they do happen in the opening couple of pages of Shivers' chapter. So you can see here we've actually got 3 hooks for Shivers operating. We've got hook number 1, sympathy. So, he's coming to a place and it's not quite what he hoped for. We've got hook number 4, progression, that he's trying to become a better man. And then we have hook number 5, worthy cause, the worthy cause of trying to give up on his violent life and becoming a better person. And then next, looking at Ned Stark from A Game of Thrones, we have him personally executing a traitor in the north. He has this great quote that the man who passes the sentence should swing the sword. If you would take a man's life, you owe it to him to look into his eyes and hear his final words. So note here, as with all the characters I've just gone through, how these opening hooks are immediately establishing where their arcs are starting at. So here for Ned, we've got hook number 3, personality. And that might be an interesting one to say because he's not necessarily someone who's coming out with these super witty lines of dialogue, or he's not particularly flamboyant. But I would say his personality is interesting because in comparison to the corruption and the decadence of some of the other lords in Westeros, he just has this iron sense of honor to him that he will not break no matter what circumstance. And as a result, that personality makes him interesting to explore in this cutthroat world. And then we also have hook number 5, a worthy cause, which is he is trying to live the best kind of honorable life he can, even though this world around him is pretty twisted in a lot of ways. Okay, so this brings us to our second story point, the inciting incident. This is when your ordinary world that your characters usually exist in is disrupted by some kind of event that begins to set the story in motion. So here, the character is typically presented with a new challenge. Often the character refuses it at first. So a character might be called to go to a particular adventure or to take on a particular mission, and usually the character is saying, no, I don't want to be involved in that. But the reason for this is that the character is still stuck in their lie at this point in a positive arc. In a negative arc, of course, the incident is actually going to be the thing that is introducing the lie and bringing this new source of temptation in for your main character. And in a flat arc, by comparison, the incident is something that's going to be challenging the truth. Again, in a flat arc, your main character is not really evolving that much in their beliefs. It's much more focused on how the world is changing around them. However, what's important here with all of these arcs is that the incident, the inciting event here, is going to be subtly changing her awareness in some shape, even if she doesn't necessarily admit that truth to herself at the very beginning. So if we look at Bilbo Baggins in The Hobbit, Gandalf brings 13 dwarves to feast at Bilbo's house. To quote from the book, "As the saying, the Hobbit felt something tookish woke up inside him, and he wished to go and see the great mountains and hear the pine trees and the waterfalls." So these dwarves are kind of stoking in Bilbo a little bit of a desire or curiosity around adventuring outside of his safe hobbit hole. But then he thought of plundering dragons settling on his quiet hill and kindling it all to flames. He shuddered, and very quickly he was playing Mr. Baggins of Bag End, Underhill, again. So once more, the character's lie is being challenged here by the introduction of the truth, but he's quickly rejecting it. He is not willing to accept the truth that he wants to go out and be an adventurer. He wants to cling to this lie that he needs to stay at home and just live this very sheltered life. So what he actually does here is he goes to sleep planning to refuse the adventure when he wakes up in the morning. Oh, and I think I should mention here, because I haven't said it already, is that the dwarves are coming in trying to recruit Bilbo to go and help them steal treasure from a dragon, essentially. If we look at Best Served Cold, we have Shivers getting recruited by Monza Mercado for her sort of quest for revenge against the people who killed her brother. Initially, he's very cautious because he doesn't want to go back to this violent life, and he has these reservations that he asks with Monza. Take this dialogue exchange here where he asks, "This man we're going to kill, what did he do?" Monza said, "He got me to pay 50 scales for his corpse. Isn't that enough?" "Not for me," says Shivers. "So you're one of them, eh?" "One of what?" "One of those men that like reasons, that need excuses. You're a dangerous crowd, you lot, hard to predict." So keep that in mind, because at this point in the story, Shivers is reluctant to go back towards a life of violence. You're going to see that change as this story continues. If we look at Ned Stark from A Game of Thrones, we have the king and his retinue coming to Ned's home in Winterfell. The king here reveals to Ned that his former hand of the king has died in perhaps suspicious circumstances, who can tell? And the king basically asks Ned to be the new hand of the king. To quote from the story, Robert was offering him a responsibility as large as the realm itself. It was the last thing in the world he wanted, he being Ned in this case. So this brings us to our story point number 3, entering the new realm. This is where your protagonist is taken from the ordinary world and kind of thrust into the extraordinary world of your story. It's important to note here that this departure from the ordinary world to the extraordinary world, it could be as literal as Harry Potter coming to platform 9 3/4 and getting on the Hogwarts Express and going into the magical world, or it could be more of an internal sense. So, for example, in a detective story, the ordinary world of your detective would be solving routine crimes and homicides. But the extraordinary world could come along where there's a crime that is just beyond their comprehension and they don't understand how it could have been committed. There's no location change necessarily for that detective, but it is undeniable that they have now transitioned from the regular rules of their usual life into this situation where the rules are all different and everything's been turned topsy-turvy. So if we look at some examples from our characters here, this occurs when Bilbo starts adventuring with the dwarves, when Shivers starts working with Mikado to get revenge, but he still has some moral reservations about violence at this point, and then this also occurs when Ned goes south to King's Landing. It's important to mention that with all of the sort of story structure moments I'm going through here, even though I do give percentage markers to help guide you as you go through this process, you do not need to adhere directly to these percentage markers. It's far more about just the general shape and the general pattern of characters being challenged in particular ways and the 5 core questions of a character's arc being integrated through this particular pattern. But you don't necessarily need to make sure that at the 12.5% mark of your story, the inciting incident is there. If you look at something like The Hobbit, for example, the inciting incident kicks off much, much sooner towards the start of the story, and it kind of goes in a much more immediate fashion. So with all of these story structure things, it is useful to know where the rough signposts are, but when you're actually coming to writing the story, you can adapt and mold these things as feels appropriate to your narrative. So this brings us to the fourth story plot point, the antagonist threatening your main character. So this is where pressure is applied to the main character, usually through some kind of introduction or key action from the antagonist. Again, you may have introduced your antagonist way earlier in your story, or this may actually be the moment where you are genuinely coming along to introduce the antagonist. What's important here is that it's the first time we really feel the pinch and we really feel the threat. So for example here, we've got Bilbo finding the One Ring and playing Gollum in a game of riddles just after sort of encountering a bunch of trolls. It's a moment where, he realizes like, this is quite dangerous what I'm getting into here. And maybe I'm a little bit over my head. We have, for Best Served Cold, after an assassination attempt by Mikado leads to a very chaotic slaughter at a brothel, Cardotti's House of Entertainment from memory, with Shivers accidentally killing a ton of innocent bystanders, he begins to question his role in Mikado's revenge quest. And then for Ned, this occurs for him when his investigation into the death of the previous Hand of the King starts to put him at odds with the Lannisters, and he begins to suspect that there's something untoward that's happening down in King's Landing. This brings us to the midpoint revelation. So in a moment of personal insight, usually around the middle of your story, your main character is finally beginning to understand the truth of their arc. However, they don't fully let go of the lie. So the reason I call this the midpoint revelation is because this is kind of a moment of epiphany that is going to hit your main character where they question the type of person they are, the type of person they were in the past, and the type of person they are potentially becoming in the future. In his fantastic book, Write Your Novel from the Middle, James Scott Bell talks about this as a mirror moment. And there are many sort of movies and stories in particular where a character will literally be looking into a mirror at this point in the story, just trying to figure out like, who am I at this point? It's often something where your character also shifts from being quite reactive to the events of the plot. So up until this point, they've just been buffeted around by your antagonist, or they've just been buffeted from spot to spot. But it's at this point in the midpoint where they resolve, okay, I actually need to take charge of my destiny. I'm going to be way more proactive from here going forward. And often when I'm plotting my story using these 9 points here, I will go in the order of working from my climax first, to my inciting incident, and then to my midpoint revelation as the third kind of really big scene to nail from the beginning of my outlining process. And again, I go over this in more detail in my fantasy outlining bootcamp if you want to check that out. So if we look at The Hobbit here, for example, the midpoint moment in this story occurs when Bilbo is all alone by himself in the Mirkwood Forest. He's kind of gotten lost from the dwarves, and he has to kill a giant spider all by himself. In this moment, he sees the truth. He sees that he is indeed brave enough to do great deeds. To quote from the book, somehow the killing of the giant spider, all alone by himself in the dark, without the help of the wizard or the dwarves or anyone else, made a great difference to Mr. Baggins. He felt a different person and much fiercer and bolder in spite of an empty stomach. And you can see by the page count here, this takes place pretty much smack bang around the 50% mark of The Hobbit, or at least in my edition of it. And it's exactly what I'm talking about here, where you see this is a moment of epiphany where he realizes that he is potentially becoming someone else and that he actually can become this other person. If we look at Best Served Cold, the midpoint moment here is particularly brutal in this story. So after Shivers gets his eye burned out during torture, he kind of reverts back to being very brutally animalistic and violent in his behavior. To quote from the book, Shivers weren't himself, or maybe he finally was. The pain had turned him mad, and he liked it. Again, look at that page count there. This is pretty much right in the middle of this story. He might have had one eye less than before, but he saw things clearer. The pain had swept away all his doubts, his fears, his questions, his choices. His axe had all the answers he needed. So at the beginning of the story, and remember, this is a negative character arc. The character is kind of going through this tragic downfall. He wasn't really sure who he was. He was trying to be this man of peace. He was trying to come to this new country and start over. Now in the midpoint, he has had this flash of insight and clarity, and he has realized that he is a killer at his core. And so his descent into darkness is well underway at this point. If we look at A Game of Thrones, the midpoint happens when Ned discovers that Joffrey isn't really Robert's son after listening to an argument between his daughters. It strengthens his resolve to act against the Lannisters. He tries to send his children home with mixed results. And it really makes him realize the true extent of the corruption and depravity that he's facing. This brings us to story point 6, so more antagonist pressure. I really should come up with a catchier name for this one. It's the one where the name is maybe not the strongest. But this is a moment where the protagonist's new understanding of the truth that they developed in the midpoint of your story is challenged by the antagonist really stepping up the intensity of their lie. So if we look at The Hobbit, this is where Frodo sneaks into the Lonely Mountain to steal treasure from Smaug the dragon, and there's a really interesting moment right before he goes in, which I want to read to you from the book. So his truth is really tested. Remember, in the midpoint, he learned that he can be brave enough to do great deeds like killing a giant spider, but in this moment, before he goes in to potentially confront a dragon, here's what he thinks in the story. At this point, Bilbo stopped. Going on from there was the bravest thing he ever did. He fought the real battle in the tunnel alone before he ever saw the vast danger that lay in wait. Moving on to Best Served Cold, we see this manifested when Shivers keeps continuing to descend into a real amount of bitterness and anger in his character. In particular, there's a scene where he's at this great feast in this grand hall, this magnificent space, and he reflects on how this man-made wonder was the kind of thing he was promised, and one of the reasons why he was motivated to go to Styria in the first place. But at this point, he just doesn't care. He just hates everyone there, and he's just grunting and scowling and swearing at all the people around him. To quote from the story, he jerked his knife from the split wood, the knife Monza had given him the first day they'd met. Back when he had it in mind to leave killing behind him and be a good man, he could hardly remember what that had felt like. So he's deep into the lie now. His descent into the tragic arc that he's going through is even more complete. If we look at this moment in a Game of Thrones here, it's when the king is lying on his deathbed and Ned is grappling with telling him the truth about his son Joffrey and Joffrey's true parentage. To quote from the book, "Robert, Joffrey is not your son," he wanted to say, but the words would not come. The agony was written too plainly across Robert's face. He could not hurt him more. "Take care of my children for me," Robert said. The words twisted in Ned's belly like a knife. "I shall guard your children as if they were my own," he said slowly. So here we see the immense power of the lie. And that power of the lie is that, in a dishonorable world, sometimes you kind of need to be bending your oaths if you want to achieve power. So if Ned is breaking his oaths in this moment and rejecting his truth, his commitment to the oaths that he's sworn, he could save the realm, but he's not willing to do it. Still, we are seeing immense pressure piled upon him by the lie in this moment. This brings us to story moment 7, the darkest low. At this point, this is the most suffering your main character has faced so far, and the lie, if you're telling a positive change arc, has never looked so strong. We really worry that the lie may triumph over your character. And to give some examples of this, in The Hobbit, this is when Smaug goes on to attack Lake Town, and Bilbo really questions the consequences of adventure and what he has done here. In Best Served Cold, there's a really brilliantly written sex scene between Shivers and Carlot. And it's an interesting scene because you initially think that Shivers and Mikado are getting together right after this extremely bloody battle that they've both been through, and they're kind of both very horny after this thing. It's a really well written battle scene. But what's interesting with this moment here is that it's actually a twist, and what we think is an encounter between Shivers and Mikado is actually between Shivers and Carlot, and then Mikado and Duke Rogan. So these two totally different scenes that are sort of told in a really parallel point of view, shifting back and forth between each other way. And what's interesting here is it kind of cements Shivers' extreme sort of violence, his animalism, and it's in this moment where he plans to basically betray Mikado after spending a lot of the story, initially sort of falling in love with her in many ways. It's in this moment where he is becoming fully wrapped up within the lie. If we look at a Game of Thrones here, this is another good example of this sort of darkest low moment here. We have Joffrey on the throne and Littlefinger betrays Ned. Ned is arrested as a traitor. He's imprisoned in the dungeons. And so at about the 77% mark of the story, we have this quote. "The king dies," Ned Stark thought, "and the hand is buried." And quite often when you're actually writing this darkest low moment in your own fantasy novel, this is like the time when most mentors are going to get killed in a fantasy book. This is the moment where, Obi-Wan dies and he's killed by Darth Vader. I think if you are watching through Star Wars and you literally pause it at the 75% mark, that's an hour 30 into the 2-hour movie. Pretty sure that's around the same time when Obi-Wan is getting killed. So this is typically the moment where if you're a mentor character, you want to be careful. So this brings us to plot point number 8, the climax. So this one's pretty self-explanatory. It's the final confrontation between your protagonist and your antagonist. What's important here is that either the lie or the truth will die at this point. Only one of these can survive at this moment. So for example, in The Hobbit, we have Bilbo surviving the Battle of the Five Armies. In Best Served Cold, we had this bloody siege sequence where Shivers is cheerfully embracing his role as a brutal savage, then attempts to kill Mikado. And there's a great quote here from the story that expresses this. Shivers stood there, grinning, his metal eye shining in the half-light. His smile widened, scars twisting, and he stretched his neck out one way, then the other. You can just see this full, monstrous descent that he has gone through here. In A Game of Thrones, this is the sequence where Ned confesses to treason in public. He's doing this to try to protect his daughters, but he ends up having Joffrey order his execution instead, and Ned Stark is killed. And then lastly, this brings us to the final point in this sort of 9-point plot structure here, the closing image. This is where we see your protagonist living with their new truth and need if they went through a positive change arc. Obviously, if you're writing a negative arc, you flip it around here and we see them kind of living fully in the throes of the lie. And typically, a good closing image will mirror the opening image of your story as a way to show change and transformation within your character. So for The Hobbit, for example, we have Bilbo returning to the Shire, but he was no longer quite respectable, to quote from the book. He took to writing poetry and visiting the elves, and though many shook their heads and touched their foreheads and said, "Poor old Baggins," and though few believed any of his tales, he remained very happy to the end of his days. So you can see him here living with his new truth and his new need. In Best Served Cold, we have Shivers leaving Styria and returning to the north. He's basically embraced a life of violence and nihilism at this point now, which is the lie. And there's a great exchange between him and Mikado towards the end of the story. "You lost yourself, Shivers," says Mikado. "No, I found myself." Might be he lost an eye down here in Styria, but he was a better man, of that Shivers had no doubt. A wiser man. Used to be he was his own worst enemy, now he was everyone else's. So again, he has gained a lot of clarity, even as he has gone through this process of kind of losing his soul. In A Game of Thrones, the closing image here, we have Ned Stark's death, basically kicking off the War of the Five Kings. The realm is thrown into chaos, and the lie has quite clearly defeated the truth in this scenario. So that was a really detailed look at how to write a great character arc. I hope you find it useful for your own fantasy stories. Again, if you would like to apply to work with me to help on your character arcs directly, check out my Fantasy Outlining Bootcamp, and I will see you in the next video.